Background blur is a way to add a little more depth to your website. But if you don't know where to find these settings in Squarespace, you can be left with a site that feels a little generic and bland. I'm going to show you two ways how to do this. The first is going to be a no-code way, and the second is going to be a way to replace that with something similar to liquid glass. So let's jump in. So my first look was at the shape block. When you add a shape block, you'll notice that if you add any kind of blur to it, it doesn't actually blur the background. It isn't an option. What it does is it ends up blurring everything from edge to edge, and it creates more of like this halo effect. So that doesn't create the background blur effect that we're looking for. Even if we adjust the opacity down and change the color, it just looks like more of a halo. So I knew that wasn't gonna work. But Squarespace does have a number of blocks that have a blur setting available to them. The text block, accordion, newsletter, just to name a few. But if I add a text block here and you click on the paint bucket icon here to style the background, you'll see that there's a blur option here. So you can enable that and that will give you the background blur. It's more noticeable when it's over an image. And then you can type in whatever text you want there. So you'll notice the text goes edge to edge here. Let me change the color so we can see it a little better. And we want it to have a little bit of padding. So you can do that with the text block. What I found is you have to add a stroke. I like selecting a white stroke with a 1 pixel thickness. And I also like rounding the corners here. And now you'll see there's a little bit of padding around the text. If you don't want that border there, you can go in there and just switch the opacity all the way down and it won't show up, but you'll still have that padding. So you could change the height of this container and you could add a button block that goes right underneath it. But the problem is they're not gonna stack on each other the whole time. And then you'll also see that this button isn't going to have the same padding applied. So lining that up could be a challenge. So what I found an easier solution to be is use your background blur on a text object, but don't have any text in it, and just drag that behind whatever areas you want background blur applied to. So essentially you're using a text block and just leaving it blank, but you're using it as a container like you would a shape block. Also, as a word of caution, you want to be careful of what you put behind these background blurs. Just because it's blurring the image doesn't mean that the contrast is going to look good, even if you change the text colors. If the image is busy, you won't be able to read everything very easily. And you want to make sure that you're looking out for your users' best interests here. You don't want to make the effect for the sake of creating the effect. You still want it to be functional and usable for your users. So taking a look at the rest of the layout here after adding the blur effects throughout, you can see what this looks like with just a standard no-code version. I added a scrolling element here just to see how the effect looks with movement behind it. There's also some parallax effects on these images to kind of give you an idea of how this looks with movement. So this section has these containers that do have a background color applied to it also, with the opacity dialed down a little bit. I did that so that I could create a little more contrast, since these images would be changed out depending on what article they link to, and we don't know if it would be a light or dark image. So adding that background color will just add a little bit of contrast for the text. And there is a little bit of a color overlay on this container too, so that it stands out a bit. This effect looks great on about 90% of sites, but we could take it a step further by adding a glass-like effect to it. So before we jump in here, I just want to mention that this code I found from another video on YouTube here on the Better Stacks channel. I'll link to his video in the description so you can check that out, since he's the one that actually created this effect. So I'm just taking it and modifying it a bit to my liking. So the first thing you want to do is either in a global element like the footer or through code injection, you want to add a code block. And in that code block, you want to add the SVG code. I'll link it below so that you can access it. But essentially, this is an SVG code that's going to create the effect. It is set to display none here, so it's not going to show up on the layout. So you'll want to take the CSS code that I have linked below, and once you drop it in there, you'll see it'll show you a preview of the effect. So you can see how it created this distorted waviness effect instead of the background blur. So this is without it. and this is with the effect. So you can see how it kind of makes this wavy, liquidy effect. And the way we're doing that is we're hijacking this background filter property in CSS. So we're taking away the original blur and replacing it with that SVG that we ended up pasting in the footer. That SVG had the idea filter, so this is how it knows to target that SVG. So I am adding a tiny amount of blur just to soften it a little bit. And I did add a small 1 pixel border around the edges with a lower opacity of 40%. And I also added this box shadow effect. So this is just adding a slight inner glow within the container. And this just helps soften everything a little bit. As you can see, once we have the scroll pattern passing through, you can see how it's distorting and creating a little bit more of that liquid effect than just the plain blur. One word of caution here is when you jump into the edit mode, the effect is going to disappear and you're only going to see the plain blur. So I found that the effect is only present when you exit out and you're in your preview mode. So if you're not seeing the effect, make sure you're not in edit mode. I'm not sure why that is, but once you switch to preview, the effect will be present. If you want to tweak the effect, you can go to the SVG and there's a couple parameters there that you can adjust. So the base frequency here, you can change, and the scale. So changing the values of those can change the intensity of the effect. I'll put up a couple examples here so you can see how changing those values will change the intensity. So this isn't an exact clone of Apple's Liquid Glass, but it's a way to give you a similar effect that you can add onto your website. I'm gonna link all the code below so that you can grab it and play around with it and see what version you like better. It may be the no-code version. So if you like this video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.